Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Field Advisor podcast. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, joined today by the soybean queen, Stephanie Porter, who's a CCA and an agronomist with Illinois Soybean Association. Stephanie's based out of Taylorville, Christian County. Stephanie, give us a quick report from your region. Any field activity going on right now?
Not that I'm aware of really close to here. I know that many have been talking the last couple weeks. They're getting ready to go. Been getting a lot of planter snaps coming out of the shed. And I guess there's been a lot of talk of just how dry it is. That's one thing that's been going on. And I have been getting reports as of today of planting going down in southern Illinois, in parts of southern Illinois, whether that be Vandalia or other places south of Route 16.
As an agronomist, are you worried about the dryness? I mean, it's a topic we've been going on 2 years. I mean, 2024 was a dry harvest, 2025 was a dry harvest. We didn't get the moisture this winter. We got some, but not enough. So what are you concerned about around the drought topic?
Yeah, I think it's a real concern, and it's not something we're normally used to in a spring situation. It's usually quite the opposite. So I guess there's a lot of things to think about. One thing, I know we're not talking about corn, but anhydrous injury and that type of thing with maybe some spring anhydrous going on, especially in the south. There's been, some agronomists warning about that with it being so dry in the soil. Definitely.
What happens?
Basically if it's too dry of a conditions, you don't have some moisture, you can get some injury if you get the anhydrous too closely to the roots. And so a lot of times we're in a big hurry in a spring situation and we put anhydrous down and we immediately plant, which we should really wait at least 5 to 7 days to avoid injury. And then we should also sometimes we plant on an angle and different things. So we're not planting exactly where we put the anhydrous down. So that's one thing we do worry about in dry situations. And I have in my past received some calls on that. And it can be a little bit worse in maybe certain soil types in certain areas as well.
What else? So it sounded like you had a list that you were going to talk about with the drought concerns. Is there anything else farmers should be aware of?
I think general germination. I just watched today a cover crop panel where Frank Rademacher, who is in Champaign County, talking about how, they're in a deficit of 15 and 16 inches right now. It just kind of blows you away. If we don't get some more rain, we obviously need rain for the seeds to germinate or have good germination or even germination. And so I think there is some rain in at least the forecast here. But again, I think that was a reminder of we just have a long ways to go to get caught up again, to have good moisture for the plant to grow throughout the growing season.
This is kind of an off-the-wall question, but it makes me think about rain, moisture, irrigation. Are you hearing talks of any farmers thinking about doing irrigation because the water there's so much need for it, or is that there's no basis to that?
No, but I did happen to have a conversation this morning about controlled structures within tiling, where it's not very common, but it's something that obviously not only can you control your water in the springtime or later into the season based on that tile situation, but also nutrients that escape. So that's one thing that I got brought up randomly this morning. But no, not irrigation, not those maybe that aren't in a sandy situation that are already irrigating, or seed production or something like that. But no, nothing new there.
So also on the topic of drought, especially with these past harvests of seed quality, what should farmers be aware of on that topic?
So this is something that we also talked about last spring, and this has to do with the previous fall. and the harvest conditions. So harvesting at low moistures, and when we say low moistures, below that 8%. So if we're harvesting some of those seed beans, there could be some quality issues. So check with your seedsman, check your seed tag. It can vary by variety. It could get worse after that seed tag perhaps is placed on that bag. Just something to keep attuned to, because a lot of people I know, especially with inputs the way they are wanting to plant at lower seed rates. But as we're planting earlier and maybe some adverse conditions or cooler conditions, obviously not wet conditions like we just talked about, but if your seed quality is below that 85% germ, that's when you may want to bump up, obviously, your planting populations 10 to 15% or more, depending on that variety.
Is that a problem sometimes you discover after planting? And so you have uneven emergence, maybe it didn't come up at all, so then you're faced with replant. Talk about
Yes.
through that decision process.
Yes. So obviously it did happen in some instances last year. And so, yeah, you had to go back in. Usually for that, you would want to take several stand counts across the field. And if you get an average of maybe 80 to 75%, or sorry, 75,000 seeds or plants per acre, you might want to think about replanting. But obviously with soybeans, they're very plastic, they're very forgiving, and you can have pretty low populations. But then you can run into some issues, other issues that we sometimes don't address, the weed issues that we've had in the past. So, for example, when we have dry soils, we might not get good activation on our residuals. Like that happened last year. Not to say it would happen again this year, but it could. And a lot of people like to have plants out there in order for those weeds not to come up. And obviously, we want to get those soybeans to canopy as quickly as we can to keep mostly water in, but other weeds out. And so that is another issue that can happen and did happen last year. And when you start to have those bare spots. So a lot of people like to go in, they don't rip up the whole entire field. Then the question becomes, we go and plant those drowned out spots or those bare spots, or Stephanie, how many more soybeans on average, and we talk it through, should I be adding to the planter to get me back up to that population? And sometimes that can backfire too. And sometimes you can get it too populated and run into, sometimes lodging or other things. Obviously plant competition too.
Mm-hmm. One thing that also comes to my mind with dryness is how it affects, nutrients in the soil. I think of when you visited our farm a couple years ago, the yellowing of leaves, the soybeans. Talk about that, how it affects. Is it potassium you were saying is sometimes flares up during the summertime too? So it's just another thing to be aware of from concerns with dryness.
Right. So some of these nutrients like potassium need water to move up into the plant, and it's not necessarily that it's not there in the soil, it's just that it's not getting into the plant, and that can cause some deficiency issues, not just with the plant visually, but maybe soil testing. Your soil testing results might not be accurate either. So those are some other things we've talked about in the past when it was dry.
So before I change subjects, anything else for agronomists, farmers to be aware of when it comes to this very serious issue of drought? I mean, it feels like we talk about it constantly, but it is a very serious concern, especially at the long term. And like you were saying, in Champaign County, 15 to 16 inches, like we needed some relief, but that's not a guarantee.
I guess the other thing would be nutrient tie-up with residue. You could maybe start seeing some sulfur deficiency or nitrogen deficiency, just because those biologicals or those that help us with the breakdown of the nutrients or getting our nutrients into our plants all goes along with pH as well. And obviously, whether it's warming up, goes hand in hand, but that also could play an issue with being dry, is causing some nutrient tie-up as well.
Okay, Stephanie, I'm going to switch to another topic that's on a lot of farmers' minds, and that's what's happening with fertilizer prices right now, input prices. Farmers already facing tight margins. You throw in this conflict in Iran and everything that's coming down the pipeline as a result of that. What are you seeing as an agronomist, or conversations you're having? Are you hearing people switching to soybeans? I know you said some spring anhydrous going down in southern Illinois, but like, just what are you hearing from your perspective of are farmers going to continue with their rotation, or are they going to switch to beans? What's your thought there?
I mean, obviously, if they already have their nitrogen applied, they're not going to make the switch unless something catastrophic happens. So in the state where we more often have spring, not all, but a lot of the spring applied is going on down south just because they don't want to lose it, and so they're putting it on now. But a lot of that did have to do with pricing, where some farmers actually waited until the spring because they took the gamble that they thought it was going to be lower. Some couldn't afford it. Or, I mean, it's based on their banker and that type of thing. So it's just a lot of decisions are not purely agronomically driven, they're economically driven right now. And so we have to, it's just part of the game right now. And I think there was, on the opposite end, a lot of growers that did put on some, or maybe they did hold back on some of their fertility, or looking to ways to do that, use other products to do that if possible, and maybe do different things that they wouldn't normally do. And a lot of questions, I think a lot of a variable rate for fertility going on. A lot of people maybe backing off on their P&K. I wouldn't advise a bit. It would be a field by field basis to talk to your crop consultant about with that instance. And then maybe in other instances, I think that they're just kind of a waiting game to see what happens politically. And I just read today, and I don't know if this is true, but a senator, a representative, had taken his own tally in Iowa and had said that 45% had not put any anhydrous on, and they were just kind of in a waiting game. And so it's just something to think about, and it's real.
So farmers still have some time to decide, obviously depending on where they're located, but we're at the end of March here, and gotta make a decision at one point.
And I keep saying anhydrous. I was reminded at the CCA board meeting that we are probably one of the states, the biggest state that use anhydrous, which so there's also other ways, obviously, to put nitrogen on, and a lot of people do that. They put it on with a planter, with liquid, but obviously that could be a little bit more costly as well.
Sure. So if farmers do decide, say, I'm not going to do corn, I'm going to do beans on beans, so this is the second year they're doing beans, what recommendations do you have to them to consider when doing that practice?
So from what I've read and not heard, I have heard that a lot of people may be planting more beans this year. This is the thinking. There are those out there that are playing the game, well, there's going to be more beans, that's going to be less corn, I'm going to plant more corn. So I've heard both at this point in time. If you would, there is a lot of beans on beans in southern Illinois as a normal practice, and that in maybe western Illinois in some areas by the river, for example. They've been, it's not something we usually promote. I will say that. I do think that I've been told that it very well can be done. It usually, first off, rule of thumb is never plant the same variety twice. just as a rule of thumb. But be very careful. Very pay attention to weed control. Your weed control is going to be much more difficult because you don't have that corn rotation in there to help you with mix it up with different herbicides to keep your weeds down, especially your amaranths or your water hemp. And the other thing is diseases is huge, and your soybean cyst nematode numbers are going to possibly go up, and your disease is going to increase as well, if we have the right environmental conditions, of course, for it to flare up, and depending on the variety that you've chosen. So definitely, pick something with a good disease package if possible, fully seed treated, the whole shebang. But to me, after I give all that advice, I also see a lot of dollar signs. So, you're going to be using your full rates of your herbicides, and you're going to be using a lot of inputs in order to keep that beans on beans going. If you want to there's not much room to cut back, and in order to get that yield at the end of the year.
Sometimes it's a hard decision, right?
Yeah, it is, but you have to do what's best for you, and a lot of times it's a field by field decision as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into you had written a blog last year, just kind of going down the list of things to consider when planting soybeans. So first, I want to talk about planting timing. We always say, you go when the soil is fit, quotation marks.
Yes.
But just beyond that advice, how should farmers think about soybean planting? I mean, you think about crop insurance, replant dates, what your seed company replant dates are, the weather forecast. So talk about through that whole timing just beyond of just when the soils are fit.
Yeah, I think, I think most farmers are aware of this, but yeah, definitely keep, crop insurance dates are real. A lot of people, if you're in my past, if you're fully treated, sometimes, obviously check with your seedsman, if you're able to get a free replant, in situations or not, depending on when you plant. I would check all those things out, before you went, but there's a lot of people planting early in the state, and they're already started, obviously, in the South. And with that, I usually say if you think you feel comfortable planting corn, you can plant soybeans. Obviously, I've been getting reports with it being so dry. The conditions are really nice right now in the field. And I actually started to get, some questions this morning, would I plant or not? And I think it's very doable. We usually try to look at conditions after planting, but I think especially in our own, what's happened on our farm in the last 2 years is there's been very, very small windows to plant. And so I think that is another reason, if you have high acreage that you need to get planted, that people are going earlier, and definitely use a full seed treatment, especially fungicides in those instances. I have seen instances where seeds have been in the ground for 3 to 4 weeks. That doesn't scare me. The thing that I have seen go wrong, obviously, is a frost, and that's after the seed is up. And then the other thing would be, if that seed did imbibe some cold water, it's not necessarily the soil temperature, which we like to talk about a lot. It's that cool drink when it first starts to germinate. That can obviously make seed germination not occur. And so those are the two things that I would worry about the most. But otherwise, I'm pretty comfortable with early planting. I just don't think that you necessarily get more yield at this point in time if you plant in March or early April. It's not to say you can't do it. I just don't think it's the prime conditions. I think it's fine. Our prime usually, based on university studies and personal experience, is that mid to late April is a good timing, that we've seen based on the varieties that we have right now. the highest yields comparatively to earlier or later planting.
Talk about seeding depth, and when would you consider planting soybeans deeper than normal? So give us what you think the average would be for you, but then are there scenarios where you go below that or above that?
Well, we usually say 1.5 inches. There's obviously it's going to depend on soil moisture too. A lot of people plant deeper, especially depending on your soil types, to try to hit that moisture to get things to germinate. There's also growers that I've worked with in the past that are super ultra early planters, and they are planting a little bit deeper. And I have in some instances see where it's not something I normally promote, but I have seen where that has saved a soybean plant from it kind of slows the emergence of it. And whenever we had maybe frost conditions, the neck or the actual the plant had not emerged yet. And it did save it from actually getting frosted. So it's just something to watch out for, because when you start planting too deeply, especially when you are in conditions where you have tillage, you can have crusting, and you can also have really sporadic emergence, and that can happen also with this dry weather.
Any different for no-till?
A lot of people, it seems like in no-till situations, unless they're strip tilling, of course, are going and planting a little bit late, but that I think that has a later, it has to do with conditions aren't fit. And this year is going to be different, but in a normal year with something that is a no-till situation, it might not be warmed up enough, and it might be too wet. Maybe in some areas of the state that's not going to be true this year, so maybe some no-tillers could plant earlier this year as well.
What is a normal year? Have
It,
we seen
it
one of
seems
those?
like it seems like we used to have normal years, but it just more and more we don't have. We have very atypical than what I'm used to in my past years, I guess, as an agronomist.
I think the popular word is variable.
Variable.
Variable. Yeah.
But I think, and it was mentioned to me this morning. I mean, it's just we're not used to have to worry about seed quality. We're not used to dry falls. We're not used to dry springs. And then we had very abnormal amounts of rain last growing season. So, like you said, it's either too much or not enough. There's no in between.
Yeah, one extreme to the other. Okay, let's talk about soybean populations. You alluded to it earlier. Anything else, especially as farmers are managing their input costs very carefully right now, what's your recommendation with soybean population?
So in my past, 140,000 seeds per acre has been, I would say, the average. And not long ago, I just read an article that was put out by Corteva where they did a general survey, and they said that as well. So I also think that there's in the last 5 years, maybe more, where a lot of guys, especially in your flat black, are really pulling back on their populations. But I would be careful with that. I've started to change my tune a little bit, but I would say there's a lot of guys in Central Illinois planting, 120 to 130. They've really dropped their populations down. Again,
And why is that? Is it just to manage costs, or is there another reason?
Yes, and it's also because we don't really, and it does depend on genetics, but in general, the rule of thumb is we don't normally need a lot of soybeans out there. We used to think in my dad's day we needed more. We needed it for weed control. We needed it to obviously get canopy and to make sure you get those soybeans up. And a lot of people had drills, so they were controlled spills, and in quotation marks, where we have a lot of planters nowadays that are much more precise in planting. We have other, obviously, precision tools that allow us to have better planting than we used to in the past. And so with that and the seed treatments, it's allowed us to plant a lot less plants per acre. Because again, that soybean plant's very forgiving. We call it plasticity. It's very adaptable. And we just don't need as many of them as we used to. So we say 75 to 80,000 final stand. And so I think a lot of farmers have figured out that they can get away with planting a lot less seeds. But back to your abnormal springs or abnormal growing seasons, again, some of the things I've already mentioned, this year, make sure that your seed quality is good. And if not, you might want to bump up the population. And then again, other things really matter, like soil type. So in a lot of the lighter soils, for example, we're talking about populations of 150 to 160, depending on how comfortable they are. In Southern Illinois, for example, drainage is huge, especially on our own farm. That has really cost us some planting population, and throw in some disease with that could be affecting it as well. Your seed treatments only last so long, which we think, they're protected. No, when we plant early, it only lasts about maybe a month or less. So another thing to think about. And again, you mentioned no-till. In some no-till situations, you may bump up the population a little bit. And other things, for example, deer, like that, everybody's talking about deer now. I've heard farmers that purposely put higher populations around their timbered areas because of the deer. And so just other things to think about.
I think they jokingly said the number one pest in soybeans is deer, which is not so much a joke. It's real, but in comparison of everything else that you have out there, that could affect your soybean crop.
Yeah, it's real.
Yeah. Stephanie, I have one question I've been wanting to ask you ever since I went to Precision Planting, and they came out with I think it's called the arrow tube, where it's putting the corn and the seed orientation correctly down the soil. So that's for corn. I'm just curious. You might not have the answer to this. Have you ever seen seed orientation have any measurable impact on soybeans, or is that something you just never have paid attention to?
Definitely in corn, yes. Soybeans, I think we need to do more work on it. It would be a great on-farm trial. So,
yeah.
Hint
yeah.
to somebody out there that would like to do that, because that would be great
yeah.
It would be fun.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see those results. I was just curious. I thought of that the other day, and I thought, well, and I think Precision said they are going, because someone asked, well, what about soybeans? And that's something they could look at. So,
and then I think another thing to think about, we always talk about, these new things that are coming out, but does it give us more yield in the end, and does it economically pay to do and have all these great things too? So
yeah. So speaking of seed, we can't forget about seed treatment. So with these tighter margins, how should farmers think about return on investment on seed treatments with soybean?
So there's been a lot of talk about this. In general, in the past, Illinois is one of the, I would say, highest users of seed treatments. We like our seed treatments, especially in the central to northern part of the state. But that is something I've heard a lot of farmers talk about where they're cutting back on. I think that in general, a lot of farmers don't understand how many different components there are in their seed treatments, and some may be cutting back on, for example, the insecticide portion, or some that use cover crops don't want or use the insecticide portion because they're afraid of, perhaps slugs in certain situations. And so a lot of people, I think, are pulling out, or maybe in some areas, depending on the economics, using full seed treatment. So for sure, I would promote at the least to use a fungicide. And there's several different fungicide components. You can go to your crop protection CPN. It's called fungicide efficacy control of soybean seedling diseases. If you're just not familiar with all the different components that cover different seedling type diseases. But on the flip side, there's been a lot of talk where we have new diseases like red crown rot, and we have new new seed treatments such as Victardo, whether I should use those or not, or stick with my Saltro or my Levo components as well. So it's not all about early season diseases, but also some of the later season diseases. And a lot of those that I just named also controls early season control of your soybean system nematode as well.
One thing I took from your blog that maybe you can allude to, or maybe you've thought differently since then, but one that says research has shown that by investing in high quality seed with treatments, planting populations can be reduced. Would you echo still that thought process?
Yes, I fully believe in that, and I do think that that's where we've been able to really back off on some of our planting populations. And another thing that I haven't mentioned too is that when you have maybe some seed quality issues, that sometimes that fungicide components, depending on what they are, can help you out in those situations too. So even if you have 85% germ, maybe we'll get a little help on some of that seed quality. And again, in those lower seed quality situations, your germ, whenever it was tested, I guess that's something to check on. Did they test that in ideal conditions, or did they check that in colder conditions? And when are you planting? So that's another thing to think about. So when they do the germination test.
How do you know? Does it say on the label?
Most of the time, no, it doesn't. Most of the time, it's going to be just in ideal conditions. But I think that was a question that we got asked quite frequently when I worked for a seed company. And some seed companies might be doing cold germ tests. There are farmers that actually send their seed off and get their own germination tests. You could actually do it at home too, if you have a good sunny spot as well. Just test out, try to plant a few seedlings and see how they emerge, and then do the math, the percentage based on how many you planted, to see how well they're coming up.
Okay, we've talked about a whole slew of things when it comes to soybean planting. One thing you mentioned earlier with the drought was weed management and maybe residuals not activating to that dryness. Anything else on the weed management side heading to this season, especially with input costs in mind, what you would advise farmers for weed control?
Well, I just think that, some of those that didn't maybe do a fall burn down in some situations in the last couple of years, that really got you off to maybe a poor start as you entered in the spring. And then depending on, I think we do have some pretty good weather now for either tillage or to get in there and put some herbicide down. We ran into some really windy days last year as well that hindered spray applications. But I don't know, it seemed like it was abnormal, but I was told by the meteorologist or in his presentation that it was not abnormal. But we started to we just need to make sure we get those herbicides down, and in some instances, maybe not cut back on rates. And that would be something that maybe somebody might want to do to cut back on their inputs. But we really need those residuals out there if we can, especially if we can get that moisture, make them, some of them activated to really hold the pressure down, especially the earlier we're planting, and to make sure you are out there scouting and to get your post on in beans, especially planting early, at the right times too, when the weeds are small.
Last episode I did on the podcast was with Logan Miller, who works with Dr. Aaron Hager at the University of Illinois. We talked about pre-herbicides and crop injury risk with some of those early planted soybeans. Anything from that project that stood out to you, or you thought, yeah, that does make sense?
I think that I'm looking forward to learning, and I have not had time to watch that podcast. Um, but I've read a lot of their research reports, and in my past, I have come into a lot of situations, and it can be varietal, it can be due to obviously the environment, different soil types all come into play. But there's been some calls I would get as an agronomist where it looked a lot worse than it was. So some of that interactions between some of those pre-emergence herbicides, Alivo, they may look a lot worse than they are, but when you start to actually start taking those plant populations, and if they hold to those 75,000 to 80,000, it wasn't quite as bad. But you can, I mean, it's real, especially in some of the cases where it could affect the population, but I would be hesitant to say in many cases that where it was a huge concern for me, but certainly in certain years it could be. But just something that we, obviously enough farmers that we knew on our board or those that took our grower concern survey was concerned about. And so that is something that we invested some checkoff dollars in to get some research done on that.
Final thoughts, Stephanie, on planting 2026?
Well, I think that I'm ready to get going. I'm excited for this season. I'm hoping that we have some more rain, especially in some areas across the state. But other than that, conditions are looking really good right now. And I hope that everyone stays safe and have a great growing season.
That's Stephanie Porter, agronomist with the Illinois Soybean Association. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Field Advisor Podcast, unbiased, independent agronomy information to keep your farm moving forward. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your voice from the field. This podcast is funded by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. Stay connected with Field Advisor on social media. Follow, like, and share to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe to the Field Advisor Podcast on your favorite podcast platform.